Corinne stood at the altar in a breathtaking $20,000 wedding gown, surrounded by hundreds of the city's most wealthy elite guests. It was supposed to be the most perfect, flawless day of her entire life. But her eyes were completely fixated on a single, empty wooden chair in the very front row. It was the seat reserved for her identical twin sister, Elara. Furious and deeply embarrassed in front of her wealthy new-in-laws, Corinne genuinely believed that her twin sister had boycotted the wedding out of pure, bitter jealousy. She thought Elara was simply too poor and too ashamed to show up. Right there at the altar, blinded by her own bruised ego, Corinne publicly declared to her new husband that she was completely disowning her twin sister forever. For 3 agonizing years, Corinne would live with a burning, toxic hatred for the woman who abandoned her on her special day. But what Corinne didn't know was that Elara wasn't sitting at home ignoring the wedding. Elara was lying in a sterile, freezing hospital room miles away, secretly enduring a devastating, life-altering medical sacrifice, so that Corinne could even be standing at that altar in the first place. And when Corinne finally discovered the horrifying truth of why that chair was empty, it would completely and permanently destroy her. Welcome back to Moments and Meanings. Before we uncover the heartbreaking truth in today's story, take a quick second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below, have you ever cut someone out of your life because you thought they betrayed you, only to discover years later that they were secretly fighting a massive, terrifying battle just to protect you? In a world that is so obsessed with appearances, wealth, and status, it is terrifyingly easy to misjudge the people who actually love us the most. Today, we are diving into a profoundly emotional, high-stakes story about a bride who publicly disowned her own twin sister for missing her luxury wedding. But the tragic, beautiful reality hidden inside a lonely hospital room will completely shatter your understanding of what true, unconditional family loyalty really looks like. Let's begin. Corinne and Elara were born identical twins, but by the time they reached their late 20s, they could not have been more different. Corinne had always craved the spotlight. She was glamorous, highly ambitious, and obsessed with climbing the social ladder. Her dream finally came true when she got engaged to Julian Thorne, the handsome heir to a massive billion-dollar real estate empire. Corinne completely immersed herself in Julian's world of private jets, luxury yachts, and exclusive country clubs. Elara, on the other hand, was perfectly content with a quiet, humble life. She worked long hours managing a small, dusty bookstore. She wore faded thrift store sweaters and spent her free time volunteering. She did not care about designer labels or fancy cars. She only cared about her sister. Just 1 year prior, Corinne's perfect life had almost come to a terrifying end. She had been diagnosed with sudden, severe kidney failure. She was placed on a massive waiting list, and doctors told her she only had months to live. But then, a supposed miracle happened. An anonymous, living donor at the hospital perfectly matched Corinne's blood type. The transplant was a complete success. Corinne got her life back, and she immediately went back to planning her extravagant, high-society wedding. What Corinne did not know was that there was no anonymous stranger. Elara was the donor. Elara had secretly given her twin sister her own kidney, signing strict, non-disclosure agreements with the hospital staff because she knew Julian's wealthy, arrogant family looked down on her. Elara didn't want Corinne to feel indebted to her. And she certainly didn't want Julian's snobby mother to know that the future bride was carrying the organ of a low-class bookstore clerk. But the incredible sacrifice had come with a devastating price. Shortly after the surgery, Elara's remaining kidney began to fail. Her health was rapidly declining. She was constantly exhausted, her skin was pale, and she was drowning in medical debt from her own treatments. Yet, she kept her suffering entirely hidden, refusing to ruin her sister's wedding joy. 2 weeks before the wedding, Corinne hosted an exclusive, lavish bridal brunch at a 5-star restaurant. Julian's mother, Valeria, and Corinne's wealthy new best friend, Odette, were sipping expensive champagne. The heavy glass doors of the restaurant opened, and Elara walked in. She looked remarkably fragile. Dark circles rested heavily under her eyes, and she wore a simple, faded gray cardigan. She carried a carefully wrapped brown cardboard box. Valeria immediately wrinkled her nose in pure disgust. "Corinne, darling," Valeria whispered sharply. "Your sister looks like she just crawled out of a homeless shelter. Does she have to be here? It is deeply embarrassing." Corinne felt a hot flush of shame. Instead of defending her twin, she quickly stood up and pulled Elara into the hallway. "Elara, What are you wearing? Corinne hissed, looking her sister up and down with deep disappointment. This is a five-star restaurant. You look sick and completely unpresentable. You are making me look bad in front of Valeria. Elara swallowed hard, fighting through a wave of severe dizziness. I am sorry, Corinne, I have been working extra shifts, she lied softly, hiding her shaking hands behind her back. I wanted to bring you your wedding gift. I made it myself. Elara handed over the cardboard box. Inside was a stunning, hand-stitched lace veil. Elara had spent 6 agonizing months sewing thousands of tiny pearls into the delicate fabric, often working through the night while sitting in a hospital dialysis chair. It was a masterpiece of pure, unconditional love. Corinne pulled the veil out of the box. Odette, who had followed them into the hallway, let out a loud, mocking laugh. Oh, honey, no, Odette sneered, covering her mouth. Handmade lace? That looks incredibly cheap. Corinne, you are wearing a $20,000 designer gown. You cannot wear a homemade arts and crafts project on your head. You will look ridiculous. Corinne looked at the veil, then looked at the judgment in Odette's eyes. Her ego completely took over. Odette is right, Elara, Corinne said coldly, tossing the priceless, hand-stitched veil back into the cheap cardboard box. It is a nice thought, but it doesn't fit the aesthetic of my wedding. I already bought a designer veil imported from Paris. You can just keep this. Elara's heart broke into a million pieces. She looked at her sister, the sister she was literally dying to save, and felt a profound, crushing sorrow. But Elara simply nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Okay, I understand, Elara said gently. She picked up the box and turned away, hiding the fresh tears forming in her eyes. Corinne rolled her eyes and walked back into the luxurious dining room, completely blind to the fact that she had just rejected a priceless treasure from a sister who was quietly trading her own life for Corinne's happiness. The morning of the wedding arrived, wrapped in absolute, breathtaking luxury. Corinne sat in the center of a massive, sunlit bridal suite at the city's most exclusive country club. She was surrounded by a team of elite makeup artists, sipping imported champagne with Odette and her future mother-in-law, Valeria. Corinne looked like absolute royalty in her $20,000 designer gown. But miles away, in a tiny, cramped apartment, there was no celebration. Elara woke up in agonizing, blinding pain. Her remaining kidney was completely failing. She collapsed onto her hard wooden floor, unable to breathe, her vision going entirely dark. Her landlord found her hours later and immediately called an ambulance. Elara was rushed to the emergency room, surrounded by panicked doctors shouting medical codes, as they aggressively hooked her up to dialysis machines and IV bags. Elara's only thought was of her twin sister. With trembling, bruised fingers, Elara grabbed her cheap cell phone. She knew that if she told Corinne she was dying, Corinne would cancel the billionaire wedding. Elara could not let her sacrifice be in vain. So, she sent a brief, desperate text message. Corinne, I am so sorry. I am in the hospital and I cannot make it to the wedding today. I love you so much. Please have a beautiful, perfect day. Back in the luxurious bridal suite, Corinne's phone buzzed. She read the text message and her perfectly manicured hands began to shake. A flicker of genuine concern crossed her face. But before she could call her sister, Odette snatched the phone right out of her hand. Odette read the message out loud and immediately let out a harsh, cynical laugh. Oh, please. How incredibly pathetic, Odette scoffed, rolling her eyes in pure disgust. A hospital? On the exact day of your billionaire wedding? She is lying, Corinne. What do you mean? Corinne asked, her anxiety slowly transforming into confusion. Valeria stepped forward, gently placing a heavy diamond-ringed hand on Corinne's shoulder. She looked at the bride with a condescending, deeply toxic smile. Odette is completely right, darling, Valeria whispered smoothly, poisoning Corinne's mind. It is a classic manipulation tactic from low-class people. Elara is bitterly jealous of you. She knows she cannot afford a designer dress, and she cannot stand the fact that you are marrying into a wealthy, powerful family while she works in a dusty bookstore. She is faking a medical emergency to steal your spotlight and ruin your big day. Do not let her manipulate you. You belong to our family now. Corinne stared at her reflection in the massive golden mirror. Her fragile ego, inflated by months of high society conditioning, completely took over. She thought about Alara's faded clothes. She thought about the cheap, handmade veil. The toxic words of Odette and Valeria echoed in her mind until the concern in her heart completely hardened into a deep, blinding anger. She is trying to ruin my perfect day, Corinne thought fiercely. Hours later, the grand orchestral music swelled through the massive flower-filled cathedral. Corinne walked down the aisle, the picture of absolute perfection. But as she reached the altar and took Julian's hands, her eyes locked onto a single empty wooden chair in the very front row. It was Alara's seat. Corinne felt a surge of vicious, arrogant pride. She wanted to prove to Valeria and Odette that she was no longer tied to her low-class past. She wanted to prove she was ruthless enough to be a part of their elite world. Right there at the altar, right before the priest began the traditional vows, Corinne paused the entire ceremony. She looked directly at Julian, making sure her voice was loud enough for Valeria, Odette, and all the wealthy guests in the front rows to hear. "Julian," Corinne announced, her voice dripping with cold, calculated venom. "Before I pledge my life to you, I need to make something perfectly clear. My twin sister chose not to be here today out of pure, petty jealousy. She tried to ruin this day for us. But I am stepping into this beautiful new life with you. And I am permanently leaving the dead weight behind. As of this exact moment, I no longer have a sister. I am completely disowning her forever." A shocked murmur rippled through the cathedral, followed quickly by Valeria and Odette exchanging a deeply satisfied, arrogant smirk. Corinne had done it. She had chosen the superficial approval of toxic, wealthy women over the fiercely loyal twin sister who had literally given her a second chance at life. When Corinne got back to the bridal suite after the ceremony, she picked up her phone and sent one final, devastating voice message to Alara's phone. "Do not ever contact me again," Corinne spat into the microphone, her voice devoid of any human empathy. "You are a jealous, pathetic liar. You are completely dead to me." She blocked Alara's number, tossed her phone onto a velvet couch, and walked out to enjoy her $1 million reception. She had absolutely no idea that in a freezing, lonely hospital room miles away, a nurse was gently holding Alara's hand as the fragile twin listened to the cruel voice message, weeping silently as her failing body slowly gave out. 3 agonizing years passed. For Corinne, the glorious billionaire fairy tale she had desperately chased quickly turned into an absolute, living nightmare. Julian's wealthy family was not just superficial, they were entirely ruthless. The moment the initial excitement of the wedding faded, Julian showed his true colors. He was deeply arrogant, unfaithful, and emotionally cruel. When Corinne began struggling with intense fatigue and required highly expensive anti-rejection medication for her transplanted kidney, Valeria and Odette completely turned on her. They called Corinne defective and a burden. Within 2 years, Julian abruptly filed for divorce. Thanks to an ironclad, brutal prenuptial agreement that Valeria had secretly orchestrated, Corinne was thrown out of the massive estate with absolutely nothing. Odette immediately took Corinne's place in the elite social circle, laughing directly in Corinne's face as the heavy gates of the mansion slammed shut forever. Corinne was left entirely broke, humiliated and terrifyingly alone. She moved into a tiny, cramped, water-damaged apartment on the outskirts of the city. To survive, the once glamorous bride was forced to work exhausting double shifts scrubbing tables at a rundown diner. Her designer gowns were replaced by a faded, grease-stained waitress uniform. But the most terrifying karma was her health. Without Julian's massive wealth, Corinne could no longer afford the astronomical cost of her anti-rejection kidney medication. Her body was slowly starting to reject the organ that had saved her life. Desperate and completely out of options, Corinne applied for a life-saving financial grant at the city's newest and most prestigious philanthropic organization, the Vanguard Medical Foundation. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Corinne walked into the breathtaking, multi-million-dollar glass and marble headquarters of the Vanguard Foundation. She wore a cheap, heavily worn beige blazer, clutching her medical files with trembling hands. She felt incredibly small as a receptionist guided her up a glass elevator and into a massive, luxurious corner office overlooking the entire city. "The chief executive officer will be right with you," the receptionist stated politely, closing the heavy mahogany doors. Corinne stood nervously near a massive oak desk, praying the CEO would take pity on her. Suddenly, the private side door of the office opened. Corinne turned around and the air entirely vanished from her lungs. She dropped her medical files, the papers scattering across the pristine marble floor. Walking into the room was Alara. But this was not the fragile, exhausted twin sister in a faded thrift store cardigan. Alara radiated absolute, breathtaking power. She wore a stunning, custom-tailored navy blue silk suit. Her hair was perfectly styled, her posture was completely unwavering, and she carried an aura of immense, undeniable authority. Corinne stumbled backward, her eyes wide with paralyzing shock. "Alara?" Corinne gasped, her voice cracking. How are you here? You run this foundation?" Alara stopped behind the massive oak desk. She looked at Corinne's cheap, worn-out blazer and her pale, terrified face. But Alara's expression remained completely calm, entirely devoid of the timid sister Corinne used to bully. "Hello, Corinne," Alara said, her voice smooth and professional. "Yes, I am the CEO and sole owner of the Vanguard Foundation. I see you are applying for our emergency anti-rejection medication grant." Corinne felt a massive surge of bitter defensive pride. Even at her lowest point, Corinne's fragile ego tried to protect her. "So this is your ultimate revenge?" Corinne snapped, her voice shaking with defensive anger. "You skipped my wedding because you were jealous, and now you want to humiliate me while I am begging for money? How did a broke bookstore clerk even get a billionaire foundation, Alara? Did you scam someone?" Alara did not yell. She did not insult Corinne. Instead, Alara looked at her struggling twin sister with a heavy, profound sadness that deeply unsettled Corinne. "I didn't scam anyone, Corinne," Alara replied softly, stepping around the desk. "The elderly gentleman who owned the bookstore I managed was quietly a billionaire. When he passed away 2 years ago, he left his entire fortune to me. Because I was the only person who sat and held his hand while he was sick. I used his money to build this foundation to help people who are suffering from organ failure." Corinne crossed her arms, desperately trying to maintain her arrogant facade. "Well, aren't you just a perfect saint? I suppose you are going to deny my grant and let me die, just like you abandoned me at the altar." Alara reached into her tailored navy blue jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed medical folder. She placed the folder gently onto the oak desk, right in front of Corinne. "I never abandoned you at the altar, Corinne," Alara whispered, her voice breaking with a tragic, devastating truth. "And I am not going to deny your grant. But before I sign the paperwork to save your life for a second time, you need to open that folder. You need to see exactly where I was on the day of your wedding." Corinne looked down at the heavy medical folder, her heart suddenly pounding violently against her ribs. She reached out with trembling fingers, completely unaware that the papers inside were about to permanently shatter everything she thought she knew. Corinne's hands shook uncontrollably as she opened the thick medical folder. The first page was a strict, legally binding non-disclosure agreement from a local hospital, dated exactly 1 year before her wedding. Corinne read the bold black text at the top of the page. Procedure: living donor kidney transplant. Recipient: Corinne. Anonymous donor: Alara. Corinne stopped breathing. The air in the massive, luxurious office became suffocatingly thin. Her eyes darted wildly across the page, refusing to believe the words. But there it was, signed in Alara's familiar handwriting. There was no anonymous stranger. There was no miracle match. "You?" Corinne choked out, her voice barely a whisper. She looked up at her twin sister in sheer terror. "You gave me your kidney?" "Yes, Corinne," Alara said quietly, her voice echoing with a heavy, tragic truth. "I knew Julian's family looked down on me. I knew they would make you feel embarrassed if your life was saved by a poor bookstore clerk. So I signed the paperwork to stay completely anonymous. I just wanted you to live." Corinne's vision blurred with hot, blinding tears. She frantically flipped to the second page in the folder. It was an emergency room admittance record. The date at the top of the paper was the exact date of Corinne's billionaire wedding. Diagnosis: acute renal failure. Patient collapsed. Emergency dialysis required. The doctors warned me that donating a kidney could be dangerous for my own health, Alara continued, tears finally welling in her steady eyes. By the time your wedding approached, my remaining kidney was completely failing. I was exhausted. I was drowning in medical debt, when I brought you that handmade lace veil at the restaurant. I had spent 6 months stitching those pearls together while sitting in a freezing hospital dialysis chair. It was the only gift I could afford. Corinne let out an agonizing, guttural gasp. The memory hit her like a physical blow to the chest. She remembered Odette laughing at the veil. She remembered tossing the beautiful, priceless gift back into the cardboard box and telling her dying sister that it looked incredibly cheap. "On the morning of your wedding, my body finally gave out," Elara said, the heavy sorrow in her voice cutting straight to Corinne's soul. "I collapsed on the floor of my apartment. I sent you that text message as they were loading me into an ambulance. I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to life support machines, fighting to stay alive so I wouldn't ruin your special day." Corinne fell heavily to her knees on the pristine marble floor. The fragile, arrogant ego she had desperately clung to for 3 years completely shattered into a million pieces. "And while I was fighting for my life," Elara whispered, a single tear falling down her cheek, "you stood at the altar in a $20,000 gown and publicly disowned me. Then, you left a voice message calling me a pathetic liar, and you told me I was dead to you." "No. Please." Corinne screamed, sobbing hysterically as she gripped the edges of the heavy oak desk. The reality of what she had done was absolute, pure torture. She had allowed toxic, wealthy people to brainwash her. She had thrown away the sister who literally tore her own body apart to keep Corinne alive. "I am so sorry." Corinne wept, her tears violently splashing onto the marble floor. She reached out, desperately trying to grab Elara's hand. "I was a fool, Elara. I was so blind. Odette and Valeria poisoned my mind. I should have known you would never abandon me. Please, forgive me. I will do anything." Elara looked down at her weeping twin sister. There was no anger in Elara's eyes, but there was a deep, permanent boundary that could never be crossed again. Elara gently pulled her hand away from Corinne's grasp. "I signed the paperwork for your medical grant this morning, Corinne," Elara said softly, her voice carrying absolute closure. "The foundation will pay for your anti-rejection medication for the rest of your life. Your body is carrying a piece of me, and I will always protect it." Elara walked toward the private side door of the office, stopping just before she exited. She looked back at the broken, weeping woman on the floor. "I forgive you, Corinne, I truly do," Elara whispered. "But true loyalty is a very fragile gift. When you threw me away for the approval of toxic people, you permanently broke the bond we shared. I gave you my kidney to save your life, but I cannot give you my heart ever again." The heavy mahogany doors of the massive corner office clicked shut, leaving Corinne completely alone on the cold marble floor. She clutched the life-saving medical folder to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably into the quiet room. She had finally received the miracle she came for, but the cost was absolutely devastating. She would live the rest of her life breathing with her sister's lung, filtering her blood with her sister's kidney, but she would never, ever have her sister's heart again. Corinne's agonizing realization was only the beginning of the massive karmic shift that swept through their lives. While Corinne returned to her tiny water-damaged apartment healthy, but permanently haunted by the priceless, handmade lace veil she had so viciously thrown away, the toxic, superficial people she had chosen over her own blood faced the ultimate destruction. Just 2 months later, Julian's massive real estate empire entirely collapsed. A massive federal investigation exposed years of severe financial fraud and embezzlement. Julian was sentenced to a decade in federal prison, permanently stripped of his arrogant billionaire title. Without Julian's stolen wealth to shield them, Valeria and Odette faced an absolute, humiliating downfall. Their bank accounts were frozen. Their luxury sports cars were repossessed in broad daylight, right in front of the exclusive country club they used to rule. Odette, desperate to maintain her high society status, tried to cling to other wealthy socialites, but she was entirely blacklisted and laughed out of the city. Valeria and Odette were forced to move into a cramped, run-down motel, turning on each other with bitter, toxic hatred as they faded into complete obscurity. Elara, however, walked into a beautiful, breathtaking future. As she stepped out of the glass elevators of the Vanguard Foundation that day, a tall, incredibly kind man was waiting for her in the grand lobby. It was Silas, the dedicated, brilliant doctor who had tirelessly stayed by Elara's side when she was fighting for her life in that freezing hospital room 3 years ago. Silas didn't care about designer clothes or high society status. He loved Elara for her pure, unbreakable heart. Silas smiled warmly, gently wrapping his arm around Elara's waist. He kissed her forehead, treating her with the absolute respect and unconditional adoration she had always deserved. Together they walked out of the towering glass building and into the bright sunlight, completely leaving the darkness, the betrayal, and the toxic past behind them. Corinne spent the rest of her long life working quietly at the diner. Every single morning she would swallow the expensive anti-rejection medication her sister silently paid for. And every single day she was forced to remember the devastating truth: she had held a priceless treasure in her hands. But she threw it away for the applause of toxic people who never actually cared about her at all. The lesson in this story: we currently live in a society that constantly conditions us to chase superficial status, wealth, and the approval of elite circles. We are heavily brainwashed into believing that our worth is measured by designer labels and the opinions of high society friends. But when you allow the toxic, arrogant voices of superficial people to poison your mind against the fiercely loyal family members who truly have your back, you will ultimately lose everything that matters. True love isn't about expensive gifts or public displays of wealth. It is about who is willing to stand in the dark and sacrifice their own well-being just to see you smile. If you throw away that kind of pure, unadulterated loyalty just to protect your fragile ego, you will eventually find yourself entirely alone, holding the devastating pieces of the life you could have had. Every moment has a meaning, but not every truth is easy to face. If this lesson resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe. Comment loyalty over statuses below if you believe that true family will sacrifice everything for you when toxic friends run away. This is Moments and Meanings by Anne, and I'll see you in the next story.